Sup, freaks? It's your boy Marty here to introduce this rip of TFTC. Thank you for joining us. Give this video a like, subscribe to the channel. If you catch us on podcast apps, make sure you subscribe there. Give us a rating, a review. Go to tftc.io as well. Become a member of the site. Join the conversation. Truth for the commoner, trying to get you the high signal content in a world gone mad. This rip was brought to you by our good friends at River. River's here to make it as easy as possible for you to buy Bitcoin and then take it into self-custody. Go to river.com/TFTC, set up an account today, and you'll get $5 of Bitcoin after you buy $100 worth of Bitcoin on River. You can dollar cost average into Bitcoin with no fees. If you're just buying one off, River has the best fees in the industry. They back all their Bitcoin reserves 1-to-1 in multi-sig cold storage. They highly recommend that you take self-custody. They just introduced limits. So if you want to set a limit order below or above the current Bitcoin price, River makes that extremely easy as well. They also have real customer support. You can pick up the phone and call them if you have any questions about your experience on River. So go to river.com/TFTC, set up an account today. Enjoy this rip.
We're all allergic.
Allergic to the government, yes. Gentlemen, we are live. Incredible event last night. Tuur, you pumped it up on this show a couple of weeks ago, and it far surpassed my expectations.
I'm so glad we did it. I mean, honestly, and it came together so easily. I feel like it was just bound to happen. Like, you know, everybody here, you know, who organizes the events at Bitcoin Commons was just so accommodative. And then, of course, you know, Austin was so enthusiastic right away, and Kelly was also on board. Like, both of them like came in from out of state. Yeah, it was amazing. It was awesome. The energy in the room was electric. It was awesome.
Yeah, awesome. What was it like for you?
I don't remember it very well. I drove, like I said, I had 2.5 hours of sleep the night before because we had a baby on Saturday. And don't worry, my family's well taken care of. I have people staying over the house. My wife told me to go, to be clear. 7-hour drive, literally right up here speaking. And then at the end of it, I was like, I couldn't even really think afterwards. So I don't really know what happened. I'm not 100% sure what all I said. I was telling these guys this morning, but I think it went really well.
I did too. I mean, I think your connection of like what you're building and like applying low time preference to bringing beautiful sound architecture back to the world and connecting that to the Bitcoin standard. I think for the benefit of the audience who wasn't here to hear the presentation last night, I think it'd be good to get backstory on how you two met and
sure.
Tuur, when you decided to reach out to Austin to come give this presentation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to remember when I might have discovered building culture, like Austin's company. I think maybe around the pandemic or something. Like I just saw, you know, these. I think it was when you the original Moondor project, like those four, and seeing the images float around of that, and then really starting to follow it. Is when I was like, like this is special, because like there are brick buildings around the U.S., but it's extremely rare to find builders who do this, and so yeah, the boldness really attracted me, and the kind of also what impressed me is even though it's a young company, like the continual evolution of the style and the kind of like the ideas, and then, you know, seeing that like he goes abroad to learn about, like, you know, vaulted ceilings and how that can be done. So me and my wife decided we were actually going to a format festival in Arkansas, and so we kind of planned a little road trip, and it was like, let's stop in Oklahoma City, and there happened to be an open day where the what is it, Oz?
I was hosting an open house.
Yeah, an open house
at one of our first structural masonry build in Oklahoma City.
Yeah, so we went and saw it, the whole thing, and they also you know, did the interior, so it's really just this incredible beautiful house, and yeah, so we saw it. We were just, you know, very impressed. Unfortunately, you can't just, you know, it's kind of like if this house was in the neighborhood that we wanted, it's like we really might have been buyers. But we live in Austin, of course. But yeah, so we started talking, and kept in touch since, and I really wanted Austin to come over to the city of Austin to like share his story somehow. And so eventually we just made it happen last week.
Yeah. It's a good week to do it. South by Southwest. I think we had some South by Southwest overflow coming in last night. What was it like for you getting introduced to the Bitcoin community?
It's been cool and fun because it was kind of recent, you know, when Tuur called me about it, I don't know, 6-8 weeks ago or something. And I was just like, a lot of times when things like this happen, I just say, you know, because I had met him recently, like I just say yes and then see what happens later. And it was like literally kind of an offhand comment at the end of it where he mentions the Bitcoin standard, which then led to me reading the Bitcoin standard, which led to me being kind of my mind blown about what, I can't believe I was just telling Kelly on the way here that over the past 10 years, you know, I keep up with, you know, current events and media and stuff like that. And I've known the price of Bitcoin, like generally speaking. I've even owned a Bitcoin and sold it, you know, and none of the articles and none of the media talks about why. Why is it a big deal? Why does it matter? And so for me, that's the important part, is like understanding the underlying philosophy of it. And then so immediately made the connection of like, oh, these people are shared values. And that's what I look for in my company, is shared values, whether it's employees or customers or trades or vendors. Is we need people that share the values and the mission. And so like, I just got excited about that, you know, of talking to other people in a different group that think differently than me, that know about different things, but that have this, shared value.
I think it was a breath of fresh air for the Bitcoiners in the room, because we've been quietly screaming to ourselves, like, we need more people to get this. And like, I think that's what we're really honing in on, is like find these tangential movements that are aligned philosophically and like be like, hey, we love what you're doing. We think you'd love Bitcoin too. And it's just a perfect marriage, particularly when you dive into what you were talking about last night, specifically the patient capital part. Like, you need sound money to have patient capital. And you know this firsthand, Kelly.
Yeah, it's come to a point, and we kind of discussed this last night. It's come to a point where when you're trying to build things, you're reaching the end of the time horizon for what, you know, credit or capital is willing to do today. So a typical development project may take you 5 or 6 years, right? From very beginning to very end, whether that's buying the land, getting the entitlements, doing the construction, filling it up, selling it, all these other things. So you're reaching essentially the end of a lot of people's patience to deliver a return. So when you start to combine, you know, basically the speed of construction that you need, the materials that you need to accomplish that speed, it really starts to scale back on what you can build. So when you see pictures of Austin's projects that are beautiful brick masonry stuff, and then you look at, you know, across the street even or somewhere else, it's like, how on earth did that get built? And we're really reaching a point, like I said, where we're at the end of what capital is really willing to put up with. So, you know, when you have a different kind of money that's, you know, quite frankly, looking to wait, you know, like Bitcoin is, when we say we have low time preference, we're literally discounting the future, saying we're willing to wait. So, you know, it's a very interesting point where there's two, at least in our community, there's two forces that are going at each other. It's how does the fiat system, you know, continue to function? How do we continue to stay in business when we have to work like that? And on the flip side, we know that this is coming. So how do we prepare ourselves and plan or design so that when the time is right, we can pick up and continue? And I'm sure Austin can speak to this because he's worked, you know, with master masons. It's just there's not the skill today that exists in order to pick up, you know, in the patient capital, low time preference construction methods in craftsmanship versus what we have to work with today. So I think it's a very interesting dynamic. But I'm a big fan of what he talked about last night and how he put it. I was stoked. I think last night went great, and I hope that there's more people within the real estate and construction business that have, you know, similar values and are thinking to themselves like, you know, we've gotten to this point now where we're quite literally worried about the durability of some of these buildings and they're being slapped together. And, you know, across the street, if Austin builds a brick house, you know, everybody's looking at each other, then looking across the street at this house and saying, wow, where's, why can't I have a house like that? Or why isn't there more houses like that? So patient capital, I think, is really what opens the door for that. The fiat system's not necessarily set up for that. It's probably the antithesis of that. But very much looking forward to that changing.
Yeah. That's crazy to think. I think Bitcoiners, like the fiat standard is here on the bookshelf, and it talks about all areas of our life where fiat money has corrupted these systems, whether it's healthcare, education, finance, whatever it may be. But I think where it's most visibly pronounced is like real estate and housing, and going like it's an industry where the incentive's been so perturbed that what you're doing, Austin, is like a heroic act almost, because the incentives are such where you're incentivized to build cheap, shitty houses that are not durable and are basically built to last for 30 years.
Yeah, no, and it's hard what we're doing. I was talking, like, we're constantly having to, now that we're building houses, we're almost done building spec houses because we can't do it anymore because the system's so broken. That, like I said, we build a great house. Everyone loves it. The buyer even wants to pay for it. And the appraiser come in and just says the house next door is worth X, so that's what your house is worth and that's what the bank will loan on it. And so then the buyer can't buy the house, even though it's a way better house. They're just saying this shitty house over here, it's just so stupid. And that's just one example of the million things we have to deal with. And then when you're raising money for a project, like what Kelly's doing, more development, or what we're doing too, and you're looking investors in the eye and saying, we're going to do this, and then timelines start getting messed up or whatever, budget overages, you have to value engineer or you'll never do another deal again. It's not like people are bad that are doing this. And that's why I finally realized it's like the key here is patient capital. It has to be. But I do think you can still do it on a fiat system, because I don't know how long it's going to take for, like, what is going to happen? Like, this could be a very long thing that plays out over a long period of time. But I mean, you see more because the fiat, if you can create great places in architecture that people love, it's going to be desirable for a long period of time. And it's going to cash flow for a long period of time. Inflation, market turnover, whatever. It doesn't really matter if you've got no debt or low debt on it. And so that's kind of what my current bet is that I'm going to start working on, is trying to find people that think that way, even if they're not Bitcoiners per se. Although I think the Bitcoin mindset is awesome for it. But like, hey, who wants to, rather than trying to try to get a 5-year, 7-year exit, put your money in, keep it there for 20 years, and then look what we get to build with it. Look what you've helped contribute to the world. And I think there's people out there like that.
Yeah. I mean, Tuur, your presentation, you're basically like, it is going to be Bitcoiners. I mean,
I believe so.
I mentioned this 2 weeks ago. I've never seen you more bullish. Last night's presentation, you're like, we're going to take over the world and rebuild it in a beautiful way.
I mean, like, if you look at, then that's what was my point in the presentation, is like, we always think of ourselves as like, we are Bitcoiners and we want to do certain things. But at some point, the scale of Bitcoin becomes so big that we really start becoming an important part of global culture. And not just in terms of production of ideas, but actually producing physical footprint in the world. So like, based on the estimates of Glassnode, there's now 2,500 people in the world, we don't know who they are, and it's a good thing, who have more than $50 million worth of Bitcoin, and that means they are 1% of the global financial elites, of global ultra high net worth people. So if we go to $1 million Bitcoin, that becomes 10%. 10% of the global elites. If we go to $5 million Bitcoin, all of a sudden we're talking 40% of global elites are people that have kind of the foundation of their wealth was in Bitcoin. Just like how the .com entrepreneurs really made a huge dent and became like the most prominent wealthy people, just like how in the early 19th century you had the oil barons and things like that. So it's just, this is like a new era, is what I truly believe. And so, we're also like, we have these strong values. Like we want to do things differently and leave a mark and like kind of like show that we really care about durability, about utility, about beauty. And so I think it's gonna mean that we're gonna lean into classical architecture again, which means, just building solid, amazing, sturdy buildings for the next generations, to kind of also, it's great, it's beautiful, but I think it's also going to show the world that, like, hey, just like when you go to Venice and you see those Renaissance building, it's like that period was special. Like, it takes a special thing to build a special building. And so I think there's going to be a lot of enthusiasm and I want to further explore that idea. Like, what does it even mean, Bitcoin urbanism? Where do we want to take it, to kind of go from Fiat slums to, like, Bitcoin neighborhoods? What does that look like? And that's why I wanted to, help start this conversation.
Yeah. You got a clap from the Pleb Lab Builder Day out
Yes.
there as you're going on the
Very
mountain.
I just heard that it was called Pleb Lab, and that was very funny.
No, it's like building, and I really like what you, Kelly, and also what you two focused on last night, where, like, how do we fix this? And Kelly, you mentioned, like, centralization got us into this problem. There's no top-down design that's going to fix it. It's got to be block by block. And we were shortly discussing before you hopped on stage, like, I'm a huge fan of Chuck Marohn and Strong Towns. That book, I think, changed my perspective on how to look at these things. And it is the right way. It's going to take a lot of hard work. It's literally going to be block by block. And I think Bitcoiners, it's funny, you say block by block in the physical world, and, like, that's literally like a Bitcoin.
That confused me for a moment when he said that. It's like,
Yeah, because we think block by block.
Oh, that's
maybe
funny.
maybe
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
a pun.
TikTok
Who knows?
Max block. But it's going to be a long, arduous road, but it's literally just going to be small acts by individuals and companies like Builders Culture to, like, materialize and go attack this massive problem.
And that's what's, you mentioned block by block, and that's exactly how we think about it. Like the little rendering I showed last night of what we're doing, it's about half of a block. It's a little over an acre. We don't have a full block quite yet, but we're already making that work in kind of normal environments, even though we'll probably be doing concrete block, because we're really about masonry-based systems. But, if you have patient capital, and if you are actually building something truly great that is creating real value that people love, you can actually, you can buy it. What we do is we buy blocks. You can buy blocks and blow them up. You know what I mean? Like, buy blocks, tear down the old houses that are, a tiny 1,000 square foot house on a 7,000 square foot lot, and completely remake it. Create a little village per block, essentially, is what you can do. And that's really possible because in the current fiat system, you could say, capital has and it's less about fiat system, just the time horizon of an investment. Like, you really can't do that because you have to, you can only pay so much for the house if you want to buy up that block, you know what I mean? But if you actually have patient capital and you've got kind of a 20 to 30 year time horizon, you can pay $50,000 extra for that house, and it's not going to matter. And you can beat everyone else out at it doing it. And then you can create an amazing place, and by the way the people you're displacing, right? If you're offering them, above market, they're just like, take my house and love it and go. And you can also do swaps and say, hey, if we buy this, we'll, let you buy this at the same price. So you actually stay in the same neighborhood. And that's why I talk about relationships too, is so important, that you can't just come in and impose stuff. We talk about being anti-centralization, and that's where I think it really is important, Strong Town's point, a ground up thing, people on the ground that know their neighborhood. Kelly in Scottsdale, people in Austin, me in Oklahoma City and Edmond, where I know the place and I know the people and I care about the place and the people, and we can build real places like that, and respond, because people are complex, and we want to make people not complex, as if we're just like robots or something, or widgets, and we just need like food and shelter. It's like, no. I mean, humans are profoundly deep and emotional and connected, and all sorts of other things that I think we really have to keep in mind when we're building these places.
Yeah, well, the other side of the coin there too is, like, humans are complex, emotionally driven individuals, and that's like, we've dove into this the first time it came on the show, but, like, the physical space that you live in literally affects you psychologically, and the physical space that has taken over our world in America is ugly, brutalist. And the day in the life examples that you gave yesterday, it's like, how do we get away from the typical day in the life in America now to the one that you put forth that exists in Europe and a few cities in America? Like, I'm from Philadelphia, and I do think Philadelphia is a great downtown's a great walking city. It's got its problems, obviously, but you can see that it was built in a time before fiat money. in a lot of areas.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and like I grew up in Bruges in Belgium, and so I remember recently a friend of mine like fell on harder times, like financially, and he his life is actually not that different from before. Like, you know, he can, in terms of like he doesn't even need a car. Like, he's like bike around and just like there's so many beautiful places that are just available and that are exactly built in the way that you're talking about, these like, you know, tiny little parks that are just kind of hidden inside a block, very, very narrow streets, things like that. It really is quite amazing what it does to like the quality of life to whereas like if you're poor here in Austin, I imagine your life changes dramatically. Like as soon as you lose access to a car, like that, it just turns everything upside down. Yeah, and then you're relegated to whatever housing projects, and you're kind of like being siloed, you know, and you get more and more. I feel like it's more of a trap. Even though I still think mobility is way, you know, more powerful in the U.S. still than in Europe. Like you can work your way back and things like that. But structurally, yeah, it's a huge. There's a huge relationship between quality of life and how your built environment looks. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, your example of like Section 8 housing, like it's perfect. Like perfect example of like you have the Section 8 housing. It's typically poor people. If they do make it out, the first thing they do is leave and not. I think the most powerful thing you said with that example is like you leave and you take your example of like picking yourself up from your bootstraps
and your connections, because that's what like mobility is all about: connections, meeting people, meeting you guys, right? Like who knows what combustible collisions come from that, and that's really what, you know, people with better means, like they have more access to people, and for those kind of random moments of serendipity to happen that suddenly land the job. If you're isolated in suburbia without a car and you're poor, how are you gonna like? You know, the internet changed a lot of things, which is great, but still, you know, it makes it tough. I mean, you mentioned the science stuff of how we feel, you know, based on the architecture, and there, you had a book out, Ann Sussman's book, I forget what it's called, Cognitive Architecture or something. Yeah. Yep. I mean, basically it's, you know, these humanist cities from the Renaissance, that they really were trying to embody kind of these higher ideals of humanity in the city, you know, is really thinking about the city as a piece of art. And they kind of came to that conclusion from a non-rational way of thinking. But now we're actually proving the exact same thing with science. Like actual science is showing us that the chemicals released in our brains when we see and experience certain things are profoundly different based on what we're looking at. And people want to say there's not such things as real beauty in the world. Okay, I get that there are subjective natures to beauty. Of course there are. It's both objective and subjective. But man, 90% of people agree what a beautiful woman is. 90% of people agree what a beautiful neighborhood is. And they might not want to live there, right? They might be like, I love this, I love being here, I don't want to live there, it's not my favorite style, but like people generally agree about what is actually beautiful and life-giving. And then those things are actually good for us and healthy for us. And that's kind of what I mean by that. People are complex. And I think we're probably going to learn a lot more about how our, like over the next 50 years, about how our environment and our day-to-day lives really does affect us, and not just our emotions, but kind of like even at a deeper level, you could say like even spiritually or something like that. That's what I think.
Don't you guys think it's funny that, you know, proponents of modernism and postmodernism, like they can't help but tacitly acknowledge what you're saying by just, if you look at their advertising, it's always like, ooh, this lush forest, and then, you know, the house emerges, and, you know, it's always like they just, or like, ooh, then you see like a classical house in a reflection all of a sudden, right? It's like, you know, they know that this is what people love, is like that sense of nature and connection, but like, but they're trying to sell you a cardboard box, so they have to like find a way to spruce it up a bit.
Here's your glass cube in a beautiful forest. Yeah. Don't
but
mind
look at
the glass
view,
cube, though,
right? Yeah,
which I want you to buy it. The forest is what it's about. It's like, wait a minute,
right?
Yes, I am a modern architect and I built that, but that's not what's important here. So, are you sure? Yeah. I'm pretty sure this is what you're trying to do.
If you have to explain it, you probably didn't build great architecture.
Yeah. And you know, back to like what Austin was saying. Yeah. So when they're measuring people's emotions, when they look at the buildings and stuff, like they have eye tracking movements, and that's like the biggest tool that Ann Sussman and Justin Hollander, and there's another report I read. It was about the same thing, but different granularity, or different distances and granularity of the ornamentation of buildings and stuff, how it quite literally affects your brain and what you look at subconsciously, right? So when you see beautiful arches and all this stuff, your eye looks at it. And if there's ornamentation, your eye looks at it, even if it's just for like a split second, right? Your brain absorbs that information and you are essentially pleased with what you see. Whereas if you look at modernist design and construction, your brain quite literally just ignores it. So in the eye tracking, there's no focus points. It's just people see it, but they don't see certain things. They don't see the arch, or they don't see the ornamentation, or they don't see the ornamentation on the door when they're 10 feet away, right? So when we talk about places, humans, basically evolved to see certain things at certain distances, right? So when you are in, let's say, an old European square, the distance is typically, I think it's like 21 meters. So that's about the distance that you can see the whites of somebody's eyes. So you can tell whether or not they're looking at you, right? So if you're in a social space and you don't know whether or not somebody is intent on being social with you, right? So like if you meet eyes across the room, that's usually a manner of engagement, right? That you would meet up and discuss or talk or whatever. So, the human environment is way too complex when interacting with each other to have the built environment, or even homes or places where it's designed to be the opposite, right? There was something on Twitter the other day where people were talking about the width of roads and then the mandatory setbacks for like the front of the house. And the idea was that the distance from one person's front door to another person's front door across the street was over 100 feet, or it was about 100 feet. And that totally negates the idea of like, well, if you're thinking that I want to see my neighbor or something, the 21 meters to notice what they're looking at, well, they're just too far away. So you end up in an environment where you can't see your neighbors. They're too far away to even look at to begin an interaction. And this is something that Austin talked about last night. When you build a subdivision and you have a detached sidewalk, it's not like let's go for a walk around the neighborhood. It's like, okay, I guess we're going for a walk around the neighborhood. It's a manner of just getting outside and being essentially corralled, and it's not a humanist environment where you can go outside and interact with people. Jane, I just forgot her name. Death and Life of Cities.
Jane Jacobs.
Jane Jacobs wrote about, what's it called? The Sidewalk Ballet, where people essentially have interactions with each other that are totally unplanned. They're serendipitous, and what becomes of that. So we live in an environment that's been stripped of that essentially by decree, and it's not there's not some central planning authority in Washington D.C., right? It's your local jurisdiction that does that. So I got a little off on a tangent, but there is certainly an emotional reaction to your built environment, and that emotional reaction evokes essentially nothing in the way that we live. And that's partially why I think depression and all these things are so high in these neighborhoods, because there's nothing to engage in, right? When you're by yourself, or you're not able to engage with other people, because it's literally designed to separate you. So
it feels like outside of these circles, most people don't recognize this as a problem, right? Like to think the solution to depression, alcohol, like all these addictions and drug abuse today is like therapy, a pill, or something else. It's not like, oh, why don't we go look at our physical environment, how it's affecting us. Maybe if we change that, it'll begin to push these things.
Yeah, it's the boiling frog syndrome, right? And I feel like Austrian economists would really like hear all this and be like, yeah, this is the result of interventionism, where the more governments intervene, the more problems are created, which beget even more interventions, which then make other things worse. So there's all these knock-on effects that eventually lead to this very sterile environment where, maybe they're tempted to intervene even more and be like, yeah, why wouldn't we have like, government planned 10-minute cities? And, it's kind of like that's the height of hubris, right? That they think they can solve it. Whereas what we really need is hands off and like ease off on these zoning requirements, ease off on a lot of these things so that capital can start doing its work and the market can just experiment with how do we even fix this? I wouldn't know. I wouldn't have some grand plan to fix Austin or any other city. It's like the solution has to come from the bottom up.
That's my big problem with Austin. It's not a good walking city. My whole life I've lived in walking cities where it's Philadelphia, Chicago, or New York, and like here, just living 2 miles away, 2.5 miles away. I can't walk here because there's too many like large roads. And
even a place like Bastrop, it's like a wonderful little town. It's beautiful. I think it has the most old buildings of any town in Texas. But like they have that road that's just like going right through it. All that traffic is going just straight through it. And
good old fashioned Strode, just ruining
Stroding, yeah. What is that? Mixing street and road?
Street and road, yeah.
yeah.
Quick break here, freaks. This rip is brought to you by Gradually Then Suddenly, a framework for understanding Bitcoin as money by Parker Lewis. I wrote the foreword to the book. I'm honored to have done so because it's the best 0-to-1 primer if you're looking for a logical explanation of why Bitcoin obsoletes all other money. Buy one for yourself and maybe a few for your friends. Go to thesafehouse.com/gradually. That's thesafehouse.com, safe spelled SAIF, thesafehouse.com/gradually. Use the promo code TFTC for $5 off at checkout. Buy it now, freaks. The price of Bitcoin is going up. You need to understand it. This is the best 0-to-1 primer. Back to the show.
It's funny you mentioned like you don't notice the ugly architecture. I mean, what's going on in the neighborhood I live in here in Austin is like they're knocking down a bunch of the old ranchers and building these square boxes. I think people say they're like California design, modernist, disgusting things. My wife hates them. We take walks to the playground around the neighborhood all the time. And she's like, every time we walk by, like all these new houses coming up, she's like, these are hideous. I can't believe anybody would buy this. And we rent a rancher that was built in the 60s, and it was built in a modular fashion. It's actually pretty cool. It was a rancher, and then they built an addition for like a second floor loft that we have a guest room up there. But you can see in that old design, they made it in a modular way, and you can tell the design of the house was in such a way that was conducive for the environment here with the heat. Like we have like natural shade and things like that naturally cool the house. And it's little design aspects like that I don't think are even thought about with these huge square boxes.
No, just buy a bigger air conditioner.
Oh my God. Like all the clamoring
consume
about
more product.
Which is like, it's like, isn't it like helplessness like on display where it's like, they're like clamoring for the UN or whatever to fix climate change. Whereas like, yes, if the temperature goes up, you can actually build in response to that. Like, look at how people live in Iran. Look at how people have lived for hundreds and thousands of years in like very high heat environments. There's perfect solutions for that, but it has to, it takes a more patient approach, these things.
Austin, do you guys build with temperature in mind, local climate?
Yeah, in terms of insulation and things like that we do, but like from temperature wise, like I'm not that concerned about it. I'm like, hey, can we just solve clean energy? Why are we putting all of it on the building to be energy efficient? Like I think it's because it feels like people can control it, and it's frankly coming down from code officials, but like it's so cultural now. Like when someone walks into our house, they'll ask like two main questions. They'll say, where do the mechanicals go and what's the R value? Because people have been programmed.
What's the R value?
Insulation, like kind of the insulative capacity. And sometimes they might say R value because they kind of like know it's a little bit fancier word, but it's basically saying what's the insulation and how energy efficient is it? Because we program people to be like, that is the most important thing about the house. How energy efficient is it? And it's not that I don't care about energy efficiency. It's just about down here. I'm about creating the best possible house, and that's going to be context and beauty and the health of the materials and the durability of the materials, and yes, the energy efficiency. But by the way, energy efficiency can also work in direct inverse relationship to indoor air quality, because in the old days, we had these, I live in a 100-year-old house in Oklahoma City. It's these old 2x4s with old 1x12 on a diagonal for the kind of the sheething, and then a brick veneer on the outside. And the inside, it's called lath and plaster, these little strips of wood and then plaster over it. And, when I moved in that house, I was going, man, this is 100 years old. And I feel like this house could go another 100 years. It needs some help, but it could go another 100 years. I've been kind of crapping on, wood framing. What's the difference here? And then I also was doing some historic remodels and started to really understand even the difference between what we were doing just 100 years ago, even though they weren't like structural masonry buildings like what I'm doing now. But they were old growth 2x4s. They were old growth 1x12s. I mean, the rings on them are just, unbelievable versus today, they're like 7 to 10 year old trees, which are highly prone to rot, highly prone to termites. Then instead of 1x12s, we're putting plywood, which was reliant on glues, which are going to degrade over time. Then we started insulating them when we realized, energy efficiency is a big deal. So we started insulating those cavities, but then we realized, oh my gosh, that's causing major problems because our house isn't really airtight or watertight. So water was getting in, the insulation was trapping it. So then we started obsessing about enclosing the house completely so that, basically turning into a refrigerator, which I actually understand that does make sense to actually need to do because you've got a different environment outside than a different environment inside. But the problem is we're using all these materials that are so prone to moisture and they're so vulnerable in a highly complex system. And so that's why I would talk about masonry is so much more forgiving because it can handle water a lot better than these other things. But that's part of the problem today is water is going to get inside your walls. Yeah. The question is when and does it do damage? And the problem is with how we build today is it does do damage and it does have really bad health impacts for people. And like people don't get it's new, but I think in 30 years, people are going to be obsessing over mold in the house and things like that. There's going to be all sorts of codes about them. We already tried to, you mentioned dehumidifiers. We're trying to put dehumidifiers and ERV systems, whole home filtration systems in, because if indoor air quality can be 5 times worse than outdoor air quality in urban environments, that's crazy. And a lot of that's from the materials we're putting in our houses, from the furniture and the, all the stuff and the bromides and the fire retardants and all sorts of stuff. But we just do this without any thought to human health.
So you're saying like we basically live in plastic bags with a few breathing holes?
Yeah.
No, it's more like a giant chemistry set.
That's yeah.
And to what Austin is saying is like when you're building something, you have to consider like where's the water coming from? Where's it going to enter the house and how does it get out? So when you use brick or these older, better building materials, you don't necessarily have to worry about that because it's more of a natural defense against that. You don't want to build, an airtight brick house necessarily, but, you may have to. Now that's definitely not the case with like a 2x4 if you're doing sticks, right? You have to seal the house. You have to make sure that there's not going to be any water that gets in there. And if it gets in there, is it going to get trapped? Because that's when you get mold. That's when you get all these other problems. Even on like jobs that we have now, we have a special consultant that reviews the plans for water to make sure that any flat surface actually is sloped away from the building. They review all of the penetration details to make sure that like, hey, is there any water that's going to get in around the windows, around the doors? And then I have special inspections for all of that stuff. And this is just required by the insurance company because, they're the ones that get sued and lose the money at the end of the day. But, when you go back to, better building materials, it's not necessarily as much of a problem. I mean, like your typical brick house is not like a chemistry set like a house today is. You've got, like you said, all the things in the wood for flame retardants, which is like almost pointless. The whole idea is just to buy, an extra 30 seconds to a minute of time for somebody to escape. But then like even the stuff that's in the floors, like the carpet, or if you have like LVT, the glue, I mean, there's so much glue in houses that people would be absolutely blown away that they literally live in like,
huffing glue all day.
They're just, other than huffing glue, their house is held together by glue. You're like, holy cow.
And this is serious. Right. It's not just like, I'm tired or something like that. Like we're talking about profound effects on people. How does 41% of Americans have diabetes or prediabetes? How are 80% of Americans overweight? And like, it's not because people are just, bad people or something. The environment and the lifestyle is destroying people's lives. The amount of people with chronic disease in this country is skyrocketing. You cannot have a productive society. If you walk around and just look at like kids in high school nowadays and their health conditions and stuff, it is so sad, and it's not their fault, you know. And then of course you've got people like, you've got people saying eat cereal for dinner too, but you got all sorts of problems there. But and the other thing we don't talk about, you know, with all these glues, it's not just the people living in the house. Guess what? It's the people building the house too, sawing those pieces of plywood, those formaldehydes and the glues, and all this particle dust that you're breathing in. Yes, technically OSHA says wear a mask all the time. No one does. I'm just going to be clear. We try to abide by all OSHA rules, to be clear. I just mean, like, if you go to job sites in residential areas, if someone's cutting a piece of plywood, look, if they got a mask on. They do not. And their hands are touching these things. Our skin is highly, you know, porous material absorbing all this stuff. So we're destroying the people's lives that are building it too. And of course, you know, but we don't care about that either. I say we don't care about it. Most people, just the average consumer, doesn't know these things or think about these things. But as a culture and a society, as an industry, I think we should talk about all these things.
Well, and then regular people who get an inkling of this stuff going on are like, well, that's capitalism for you. And so then they're like, we need the politician to fix it all.
I feel like that's the guy smoking a cigarette, just like, oh no, not this conversation again. Yeah.
No, it is. Well, that's another thing.
That's sad, right?
We've been talking about a lot, or I've been talking about with a lot of people. We actually just had an economist on who worked at the Fed under Alan Greenspan. Episode drops tomorrow. But like, that was a big thing. Like, he's running for Congress, like with the stated goal to like convince people like it's not capitalism. Like, we don't live in a capitalist society. And we really anchored back to the first principles of us not living in a capitalist society is we don't have free market for money, which is the most important tool we use throughout the economy. You can't have a capitalist society if you have government controlled money. Like, from that point on, everything is centralized to an extent.
I love how Millet explains it to the kids, basically. He's kind of like, just look at these buildings. Like, these new buildings are ugly. They're built in a system where the government is everywhere. Look at the older buildings. They're amazing. This was built in a time when free markets actually had some room to breathe, you know? So like,
and things were getting financed by people in you know, in the area that were doing things.
Right,
and so they care because if you're off in a boardroom in New York or something, managing a fund or a family fund or whatever it is, you're just looking at spreadsheets to decide where the next investment's going to go. And you can be a great person, like, right? Some of those people are not, but I mean, some of them can be great people, but you're still just making decisions strictly based on a spreadsheet, strictly based on numbers. You don't care about Austin. You don't care about Oklahoma City. You just are looking at numbers and you think you can extract, you know, the most profit from this place. And then when you only have 5 to 10 year holds, there's no incentive for anyone to build it really well because it's going to be gone. You're going to sell it. And that's why I love about the old way of doing things is, I mean, just even 60 years ago or 80 years ago, developers were building and holding on to them for a long time. There was no exit strategy and your incentives can immediately change.
Yeah. It's crazy because in the world of real estate investment, the first questions are like, how well built is this property going to be? Like, how happy are they going to be? Are the people that are living in it going to be? It's like, what's the IRR?
Yeah.
Like, what's my MOIC?
What's our in, what's our out, what's the IRR?
Yeah.
10 years? Are we doing 16%? Are we doing north of 15? Yeah, I don't want to look at it.
Kelly, in the car, you were talking about the mobile homes. Like, that was fascinating.
Yeah.
We were talking about this at lunch.
Yeah. And so in the summary of the conversation was that my dad and I have done a couple tours of mobile home factories in Phoenix. And we're like looking around and we're like, that looks a lot like the stuff that we build. The same quality, same material, you know, cabinets are nice. Countertops are probably a little bit different, maybe a different flooring, but it's like, you know, overall in general, the constructability of these things is pretty good. And then you get further into it and these guys are like, yeah, if you want to upsize your subfloors, have thicker things, if you want to have a 2x6 exterior wall, we do all that. And you're like, wait, you do all this? I thought this is just something that I do on site, you know, that's just site built things that are the reason why site build is quote unquote nicer and better. But it's just gotten to the point now where, you know, their technologies have improved because they have to respond to certain markets, right? They have different regulatory sets. But for us, it's like we're value engineering everything we possibly can to essentially have an affordable product on site. And then these guys are over here like, yeah, I can do that for 40 cents on the dollar. And it's just as good. And you're like, well, this is a problem. So, I mean, it's just something that we're having to look at. You know, in economics, we would call that the substitution effect, right? Where as prices increase, people will look for essentially inferior goods because they just can't afford the price increases.
And I wonder why there's not affordable housing.
Yeah, and what it comes down to really, I mean, for a lot of it is just, the increase in the money supply causes generally an increase in prices across the board. But if your incomes don't go up 40% to afford the cost of the house that went up 40%, then you have to find an alternative. So, these things aren't like your grandpa's trailer, and it's not like, from Trailer Park Boys. But at the same time, like, with a few changes to the countertops and the floorings and some of the fixtures in this product, it's completely indistinguishable from what I can build on site. Right. And these guys, you order it a month in advance. It takes them up to 2 weeks to build, depending on what you get. And they drop it off and put it on a foundation on some stem walls or something like that. They set it, and then you have a house. And it's amazing, it's amazing from both ends. Like I said, the technological increases and fulfilling a product that has to compete versus something that is site built and is just totally beaten by regulations and costs and all of these things that just eat away at it. And it's sad to see, but like once you see it, it's completely understandable. And it's like, I guess, maybe this is what we should be doing now, because our value and what we do is providing shelter to people. We're developers and builders. We want to build and give people a place to live and get paid to do it. Like, that's just what we want to do. So if I can't build it on site anymore, and I have to do something with, modular prefab housing or something like that, then it just is what it is. There's no other way to solve the problem of, however many people want shelter that can't afford it or can't get it based on, the price. So it's a very interesting catch-22 where somebody, we all want to have beautiful buildings and do beautiful things and build all this wonderful stuff. But, the reality of the incentives is that, hey, like, unless you are going to do this out of your own pocket, or you have a group of people that are willing to sit on this property for 30 or 50 years and have that patient capital approach, then this is what you have to do, to survive.
And the problem is, go ahead.
I was going to say it's soul crushing.
Well, then the problem compounds because, there's 2 points of that where you're responding. You're right. In the natural system, you have to provide housing because housing is even more and more badly needed because housing is getting more expensive. And so and I think the mobile home is actually a really kind of smart response in some ways to the system, because it's like providing the best quality housing you possibly can within the working system. But once again, are you creating, in the end, great places that people are going to be using 200 years from now? No, of course not. But no one is today. No one's really able to build those things. And there's 2 main problems with that. One is, is it Amos with the book Bitcoin? What is his name?
Amos, yeah.
Amos. So he talks about, the only physical limitation in the world is human labor. Human labor. And when you have to rebuild things every 50, 75, 100 years, you're just expending the same labor to do the same thing over and over again. You're never freeing that up to do something better or higher. So you're kind of like stagnating as a society, just doing the same things over and never able to elevate, beyond that. And then the second thing, we always complain about affordable housing. And I mean, politicians are just like, where's the affordable housing? How dare you, Kelly, not build a quarter house? How dare you? You're building brick houses. Those are only for rich people. We hear that a lot. And, the reason, well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons we don't have affordable housing, we don't have enough housing. And part of the reason we don't have enough housing is because all the current zoning and rules and regulations and all that. But the second reason is because we don't build anything that lasts. So it's a supply and demand issue. We don't have housing. We don't have enough housing because there's not enough supply. And when you can't add to the actual supply, it's very difficult to add to the supply. I mean, you're just going to be in a perpetual state of problem. Affordable housing is old housing.
You have a quite literally disintegrating supply because
Yeah,
It's melting away. I mean, that's why Safedine says, like, he says real estate is a shitcoin because it literally melts away. The value melts away, and the powers that be try to sell you on it because it's an extension of the fiat system. Because all that mortgage money is basically coming from them, being pushed into real estate, and so people have been using real estate as a monetary substitute to like for their savings. It's like, fiat money, cash money is one that melts away the fastest. Then you have bonds that melts away a little slower. And then real estate used to kind of be the best one, the best government issued coin, so to speak. And like, hearing Kelly's stories, like, well, basically we're going to slum standards. So this idea of like the American dream of like, you get to own your own home. It's like, no. It's you get to own your own shack, maybe, if you can make payments on your 10% mortgage, so like that like dream is starting to crumble. And I think that we have to question like the idea, like, is it really like, what are you weighing? What is the trade-off nowadays? If you keep on pushing that narrative that everyone has to own their own home, it means at the expense of literally owning more Bitcoin, right? I mean, that's the trade-off. Like, are you going to have more Bitcoin or more equity in your shack? And so to me, that is gone out the window. Like, it's just no question that it's clearly better to own hard money and bide your time and eventually maybe buy your house in cash, if you want to. But yeah, it's people don't know their history either, and that like historically home ownership wasn't as ubiquitous, not because everyone was poor and we lived in a feudal society, but because people had hard money and you would rather save in hard money. And then there was a specialized small part of the economy who would specialize in building homes, stewarding it for the next generation, maybe passing it on within the family, and they have a massive incentive to build high quality homes. Anyway, end rant. But yeah, real estate really has become a shitcoin, I'm afraid.
But don't worry, it all adds to GDP. Everything's going to That's what's interesting. It's like we have to build it all. GDP goes up. We're like, I grew 2% this year, doing the same crap we, over and over and over.
Everybody's
again.
working, full employment.
Yeah. Well, everybody's working to repair the house that they just fell apart that they just built a week ago.
Woo, we're winning. We're winning the game.
Well, I mean,
everybody was working in the Soviet Union. I mean,
but it's like it's also creating this competency crisis as well. Like you were mentioning last night, it's hard for you guys to get bricks.
So hard. There's everything about bricks, trades, all that. Everything is starting to everything's starting to centralize. Like local family-owned brick practices and stuff are getting bought up by the big companies. Private equity is coming in and buying up things like landscaping companies, and I know this isn't real estate, but healthcare clinics and things like that is a new big thing. Kind of like, do we all want a bunch of private equity owning our healthcare clinics because they saw? I don't know what they're seeing, but they're clearly seeing a profit opportunity. Yeah. Some of that can be good with upgraded systems and all that. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm sure there can be some benefits, but my bet is going to be healthcare goes down.
Yeah.
And we already spend, this is crazy, 20% of our GDP, 20% of our GDP on healthcare in this country. The most of any country in the entire world, and we have some of the most unhealthy people in the entire world. Once again, how do you have a productive society when 20% of your GDP goes to healthcare, and most of that's in the last couple of years of life or treating preventable chronic diseases?
Yeah.
Profoundly irresponsible.
And those private equity bros, they're not thinking about like, oh, let's increase the quality of healthcare for these. Like, what's the IRR?
How do we take care of people? Because that's not good for profits. If we actually take care of people, we lose money.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like leading to the decay of the nuclear family. It was like going down the two scenarios of day in the life in brutalist suburbia versus like a walkable city. Like one of the things that really resonated with me was like grandma, like going to pick up grandma. Like that's something in America that really dismays me and actually pisses me off, particularly right now, because my grandmother was living with my mom for about a year, and then she just moved. It's like she decided herself to move like away to like a 65 and over community. It's like an hour away from my mom's house. I was like, what the fuck? Like, and she made that. My mom didn't want her to leave, but she decided on her own. But the point being, the culture in America is such where it's like at the end of life, the people that raised us, that gave us the lives that we have today, we're just like, all right, go in this home.
The moment they can't drive, too.
Yeah.
It's, and the number of people over 80 years old or something, like with the boomers aging, I get everyone wants cars. If you can't drive a car, or by the way, do we want people that are 80 years old driving 70 miles an hour? Frankly, like I've got kids in my car, you know what I mean? We're over 40, there's over 40,000 traffic deaths a year in the US, and that's not including, injuries and things like that, or the cost of it. I think we're really, I think people that age are going to care a lot less about cars when they can't drive anymore. They're going to wish they had different options for living.
Yeah. And it comes back to like, not only quality of life, but like sound economic decisions. It's like when you have a good nuclear family, and then you have a very strong extended family in terms of aunts, uncles, cousins, in-laws, whatever it may be. Like that's one of the biggest problems of the fiat world right now. That suburbia day in the life that you described yesterday, it's likely two parents going to work to create two incomes just to survive and subsist. Then on top of that, they're paying daycare and schooling cost. And if you have these walkable cities where you have strong families and strong towns, like the older generations end up taking care of the grandkids. It's the way it's been for millennia, the way it should be, but we've completely gotten away from that here.
Yeah.
Totally.
It's funny, like kind of worrisome to drive around in the hill country here and just see like how the distances that people have to like travel to maintain their lifestyle. And you kind of like, I kind of I remember like just looking at some development, and yeah, it all has water, it has electricity, it has internet, but then it's like, how much, I guess, monetary energy is needed to keep the lights on in those kind of areas? And what if we go to like an inflationary depression? Like, honestly, I think a lot of the lights are going to go out, and a lot of these suburban areas are just going to sit and decay. I remember visiting Spain in 2011 because they had a crazy real estate boom. In 2006, the numbers were just insane. I think they were like consuming 20 or 30% of the world's concrete, at the same time. They had like workers from Latin America pouring in, crazy building boom. You could basically build a house with like $1,000 down. Like you could just, they would just, anybody was getting loans. And so then they had the bust, and driving around there, I literally saw that, like just completed developments that you could tell were just falling apart, were empty because they were too remote. Like it's literally the fact that socialism can't calculate the fact that you misallocate resources during a credit bubble. Like I think we haven't seen that play out. Like that's going to happen in the next 20, 30 years in the US. Like a lot of these developments aren't going to be long-term sustainable.
Which is funny because that's counter to what the mainstream narrative is like when this inflationary crisis comes, you want to get out of the cities, but it's like, they may have
I have the opposite kind of thing because we already had the white flight, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s out to the suburbs. The thing is, the suburbs are now built out. You can only go so far out. Before life gets kind of more people. One of my friends says this: the more people that kind of like come to an urban environment, the better it gets. The more people that go to a suburban environment, the worse it gets. Sometimes because traffic gets so bad and all that. But that's kind of my theory: is that a lot of these kind of stuff built in the past 40 years, especially the stuff built in about the last 20, these kind of lower end subdivisions, isolated subdivisions, those will be the new kind of slums because you are not incentivized. One, the houses are cheap. Two, people can't actually afford them. Even though they can afford to buy them, they can't afford to maintain them. And those are very expensive to maintain. Three, they can't, they're not incentivized to maintain them because if they do, spend, $20,000 to do something in their house, if their neighbors didn't do it, which they probably didn't, they're never going to get their money out of it. So if you're smart, you actually don't maintain your house and you just sell it before the fact. Because if you maintain your house, you're going to lose money when you sell it. Then once that starts happening, it's a little bit of degrading. The people with options are going to move out. People with fewer options are going to move in with fewer resources. As the house degrades, property taxes start going down, appraisals start going down, the infrastructure starts crumbling that the private developer put in, and then the city takes over, but the property taxes don't actually cover it. That starts degrading, and then basically no one wants to live there, and it becomes kind of the Section 8 housing thing where the only people that live there are the people that don't have choices. And then they're isolated without work, without schools, without hospitals, without doctors and services, and maybe electric car, self-driving cars and all that can help these things. And once again, I sound really like apocalyptic about that. The thing is, I think people are amazingly resilient too. And so these things will actually lead to opportunities to build something new for communities to bond together, to take care of each other. So it's not like one all hopeless, but it's just like what we do matters. And I feel like there's just so much of the world is just like, let's just do shit. Let's just do shit. And then it's just all going to turn out great. It's like, no, this actually like affects people in profound ways. Like just this is the purpose of life, you know, like is to build a better world. And, you know, we just don't talk about that. We just talk about the spreadsheets.
Yeah, well, Austin, nobody's going to bond together and build something. You need the government to build the roads.
Of course.
Actually, I was speaking of government. Bastrop, which is that town I was mentioning, historic town. They have like a 30-year plan, so you can like download it online, and it's kind of like how they're gonna grow the city responsibly. And they literally the what you're talking about. Totally confirmed by the government. They're basically saying it's not sustainable to have sprawl. So they have that, like, basically they're limiting the lot sizes, and they're limiting how much sprawl will be allowed over time, which I think is smart, and it's gonna make it a lot more sustainable than towns that don't do that and then end up with a wasteland, basically, that they can't afford to render the services. Like, I mean, all these things cost money, like picking up the trash,
of money.
like
Sewer
everything.
lines. Right. I mean, gosh, they're expensive. That
and that's something that strong towns, when Chuck put it out there, you know, when I had found it, I was like, you know, oh wow, like I pay for all of this infrastructure to go in. In Arizona, you have HOAs that are responsible for private sewer lines, private water lines, all this other stuff. And, you know, theoretically, the math works that whoever lives there is going to pay to replace the infrastructure. And that may have sounded good and worked like, you know, 30 years ago, 20 years ago even. But now we're at a point where, you know, if M2 is increasing generally at like 8% a year, you know, are people able to afford to replace the water and sewer now? You know, and like what Austin was saying, if it is publicly maintained, there's absolutely no way the math works. Not even by like a long shot. You'd have to increase property taxes by like a multiple of 5. Just to pay for stuff today, not tomorrow, not in the future, not any of that. So, like I was saying,
Can you say it again? Times 5?
So you'd have to increase the essentially property taxes just for the portion of infrastructure, not for like public schools and all this stuff. It'd have to be like a multiple of 5. In some cases, it depends on the city, because every municipality does it differently. Yeah. It could be an entire order of magnitude more. Wow. So, you know, there is no ability for, especially governments, to be able to do the math to maintain or replace what already exists.
But Kelly, I'm locked into my 3% mortgage for 30 years. Like, I'm gonna be fine, right?
You're gonna be locked into a 100-year mortgage with the sewer department at this rate.
Yeah, you know what was that? Was it Mississippi? This was 2 or 3 years ago.
Oh, the water pipelines.
Yeah, water pipe, but like the whole city. I mean, I think it was one of the big cities in Mississippi. I can't remember. I mean, they were just like out of water for, it wasn't just a week. Months. It was like months.
Yeah.
And they were like, and I mean, I know Mississippi is a poor state and all that, but I think there's a lot of things like that coming as our aging infrastructure happens, and there's just not money. We're just not used to that, of being told no, like there's not money. We're like, what do you mean there's not money? Can't we just like print it? Can't we just borrow it? Yeah. Local municipalities can't do that, you know, and I think you're going to see more of that.
And something to keep in mind along with all of this is that a lot of the sewer and water infrastructure in municipalities is not paid for by those municipalities. They get federal grants for those. Wow. So like in the situation in Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken,
it's so bad.
Yeah, I know. Oh, no. I swear this is not a doomer pod. This is not a doomer pod, freaks. But and this harks back to the conversation Tuur and I had, you know, the first time we talked. He said he was absolutely horrified about some of the stuff I was saying. I was like, I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just telling you, like, the facts, ma'am. You know, like, that's it. And so all the infrastructure is originally paid for by, you know, federal grant. And then, like in the situation with Mississippi, it ended up being like I think it was like a $45 or $50 million repair that had to be done because they couldn't even exist, they couldn't afford to maintain the existing infrastructure that they had at a fraction of that cost. So that's why it became such a hubbub, if I recall correctly, that the expense to repair the literal one section of the plant was so expensive that it was so expensive to maintain that they just couldn't even do it. So, it just adds the layer of complexity to an existing situation where all of this stuff can only be afforded by our ability to, print money to have debt, to afford a certain level of debt.
Well, I've got a few thoughts here. Like, I know you touched on it last night, and it's probably not the solution, but it seems like we need some form of creative destruction where we recognize the sprawl is bad, and it's like, let's consolidate, like let's get back into the hole, figuratively, like run back and like consolidate to make sure that we don't have this large maintenance problem get worse. And the other thing, like we've been shouting out Chuck a lot, but I think that book is one of the most important books that's been written in the last couple decades. But like really to attack the problem from a ground up perspective is like internalizing in people focus on revenue per square foot. And that's how you're actually going to be able to maintain all this infrastructure is if you like literally look at the square footage of the properties within your municipality and focus on revenue per square foot, then you can begin to like climb back and solve these problems.
Yeah. That would be real capitalism, where you're like saying, hey, you live in this area, here's the cost of the infrastructure in that area, and here's how much you have to pay to cover the infrastructure in that area. And if we did that everywhere, we would be so much better. People pay for what they're using and the way they're... I don't have a problem. If you can afford suburbia, great. Yeah. But I'm just against subsidizing it.
Yeah. No, and it goes back to like what you were describing last night with the drive-through for the coffee. Yeah. Like they've literally constructed it where it's like, we don't even want people to come in here. It's just a drive-through.
We don't need it. It's too slow.
Yeah.
And that's what like...
We've built one. It's an 800 square foot box and 400 of it is the freezer.
Wow.
It's like, I think about my parents in Havertown, like my dad's since passed, but they had this coffee shop like on Darby Road, like our local, like main road, but it was walkable and it's probably 300 square foot, if that, but it was a community place. They would do artwork on the window. They had outdoor seating, and it's like a place where you were describing the drive-through is completely take out the ability for these serendipitous interactions where I've seen it with my parents' coffee shop. Like it's a community meeting space where people come, grab coffee, chat up the baristas, chat up the other patrons, sit outside, maybe go to yoga down the street before or after, like that. And where you live temporarily in Philadelphia, where I'm from, like it's a very strong community, which I'm proud of. But it's because of these small businesses. And I gave my dad Strong Towns a couple of years ago, and he was like, holy shit, revenue per square foot. And like he applied that to what he was doing at the coffee shop.
And the community thing is so important what you're talking about, because I think most people in this country, including myself, kind of had a confused idea of what community means, because you see a lot of stuff marketed as community, like everything's marketed as community at this point. Every shitty suburban subdivision is marketed as luxury and community and whatever, Pine Creek Forest, and there's no pines or creeks or forests. But, I think community, we try to make it once again about the big things where it's like maybe there's like 2 HOA events a year, and I'm not against those. Those can be great additive things. We actually do this in our neighborhood. I live in an old historic neighborhood. It's a great little neighborhood, but it's still kind of like 7,000 square foot lots. It should be kind of suburban actually. But I know my neighbors directly next to me, and we chat because we take out the trash, grab the mail, whatever, and we have nice little relationships. But then the HOA, throws 2 events a year or something, and I go and I don't remember. I'm like, oh, what's your name again? Like, because you're just having the same conversation over because you don't have any of the small touches, and it's always kind of awkward when you don't remember people's names. Right. And so we think it's like community isn't about being best friends with everyone. We have so small capacity for like friendship. Once you have like family and work and kind of your basics, it's like, let me get together with my friends, once, twice, 3 times a month, maybe. And then outside of that, what you need to have an actual community, which is really, I think maybe a better term is neighborly connections, because it is that like 5-second, 30-second, 60-second, 5-minute interaction that actually just creates little bonds over time. And there's this book called Oversubscribed. It's a marketing book, but he uses this analogy. He calls it the 7-11-4 rule, And I can't remember the exact specifics of it, but he says in today's economy, for people to make an expensive purchasing choice, they need to spend 7 hours over 11 separate interactions in 4 different locations before they will buy from you. Buying a house from me, they need 7 hours of interactions over 11 different instances in 4 different locations. And locations could be a newsletter, a podcast, in person, an event, open house, whatever, and you can apply this to anything. But that kind of blew my mind, because I was like, if that's what people need to make a purchasing choice, what do people need in terms of the amount of touches to feel a sense of belonging in a community? You know what I mean? And once again, the different context of seeing someone at the park, at the coffee shop, running into someone, it's not a big deal. And that actually allows you to have connections with people you completely disagree with. Your friends, you probably want to share a lot of values. The people I want to invite into my home, that's a very intimate thing. If I want to make plans to go to dinner with you, that's a pretty intimate thing. But just to be able to hey, someone could be opposite of me, but we can play, in the park together. Our kids can play. We can on the playground or play a game of spike ball or volleyball or something like that, or who knows what is, see each other at the coffee shop. There's just a million things to create those bonds.
Yeah, we've been doing this more. I was proud last night when we were juxtaposing what schools used to be to what they are now. Like our oldest, he's 4, and he's going to school, and it's at a schoolhouse, and that's where we have these small interactions is drop off. And then we actually started going to church at the school just because we wanted to build more within that community. And it has it feels more comfortable drop off now. You see somebody at church, you say, what's up? It's cool. Drop off. And it is that the small
feels so different.
Important. We're here in the elevator, even here in this beautiful building, that's one thing I always try to do is say what's up to people in the elevator, but you can tell most people are in the corner.
Yeah, you stop investing in it. Yeah.
Don't talk. Yeah. Please don't talk.
What Austin was talking about reminded me that after the pandemic, when I went back to Belgium to my hometown, it was Sunday morning. I went to get pastries for the family at the bakery the neighborhood bakery that I'd always go to growing up, and the lady selling the bread and pastries was the same lady that had been working there for 20 years, and so it had been 10 years that we had talked again, and we had never ever talked before. We always had those little tiny interactions over a span of 10 years. What I would go there, and she trusted me enough to tell her about her the divorce and how hard it was, and it was pretty amazing. How I think you're totally right. It all this it adds up, and it builds so much trust, even if it doesn't. When you're in it and when you're used to it, it might not feel like much, but when you start living without it, it really is very different.
It's the disintegration of the social fabric.
Yeah,
it really
exactly,
is. I didn't understand this, that good manners and things I don't mean yes ma'am, yes sir, all the same. Just saying hi, thank you, appreciate it, please.
Holding the door
are actually little moments to just of humanity with each other that create these small connections of I see you, and it's not just about me and my own little head, and that's actually part of the glue that holds society together. And I mean, there's that thing of if you tell someone I don't know, call someone ugly, how many compliments it takes to kind of make up for them emotionally, and it's 7 or 10. I can't remember what it is, but the amount of positive interactions to overcome a negative interaction. And you're always going to have negative interactions, but you need the possibility to have lots of positive interactions, and we've completely taken that away, because it's just, once again, isolation from home, isolation in car, isolation to work, and you don't have the opportunities for those to unfold organically.
And then when you get to work, you go and sit in a cube.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Isolated in a cube all day.
Yeah. I mean,
at home, in the car, at work.
Yeah. We need to get away from this. It's soul sucking. And again, I'm thinking back to my mom. My mom now, she works for a legal firm, and she got an email last week we don't want you listening to podcasts in your cube. You need to be attentive. And I was like, holy fuck. I'm going to get you out of there, Mom. Don't worry. But it's
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think what we're estimating, just based on what we're doing, of course, market by market, but I think it's going to cost us probably between 50 to 80 million per block to really rebuild a block, you know, which is really generally 400 feet by 400 feet, maybe it's a couple acres or something. But that's it. But we can create so much density there, you know what I mean? But that's like what it is, like when we're talking about, because real estate is an expensive thing, you know, but like it's like basically $60 million to $70 million a block for us to kind of like rebuild and create village by village. So
like
by village
10
by
Bitcoin
village.
per block. Sounds
Yeah.
doable.
Yeah.
Well, to this point, sir, like, do you think Bitcoin demonetizing real estate as a store of value can actually accelerate the rebuilding of more beautiful
absolutely.
architecture?
Wait, what was the question?
Bitcoin basically taking the monetary premium that exists in real estate now, people realizing like this isn't a good store of value, like Bitcoin's a better store of value.
The word that keeps coming back, there's a Belgian economist, and he wrote this book called Gigantism, and which I think is such an interesting word because he's talking about like just the endless sprawl of bureaucracy and those kind of things. But it's such a good word, I think, to point at those things that a lot of people call capitalism, but actually what it is like, you know, the fiat system, it like messes up the endocrine system of the economy, and it leads to like hyper growth in particular areas. And so we're growing these extra limbs that like are basically not functional. And so what happens once you have like ultimately you will have like a corralito like they had in 2001 in Argentina, where like the banks just closed down and like there's a massive devaluation and this big shock, and what happens then is the capital retreats. And I think real estate, that'll reveal that real estate actually is very heterogeneous, like heterogeneous, in the sense that not every house is the same, not every neighborhood is the same. What you saw happen in 2001 Argentina was prices all across the country went down massively, except Buenos Aires only had a dip of 20%. That's kind of crazy if you think about it, right? I mean, because that is actually a healthy city, the backbone of which was constructed under hard money, under free markets, and so I think that'll happen in the U.S. and Europe. Like once we have those shocks, monetary shocks, it's kind of like in a way, the excess hormone gets like adjusted and it gets normalized, and of course the body needs time to adjust to this new situation, but it is long term what needs to happen to regain economic health.
I do think, you know, real estate isn't just like a store of value like Bitcoin is. I mean, right now, because Bitcoin is on the rise, it's not just a store of value, it's also a speculative, you know, investment essentially. In the long run, the goal isn't really for Bitcoin to be that, right? Because the part of it is to stabilize, or at least my understanding, to stabilize. And real estate, where that comes in after, well, now or whatever, but I mean, is real estate is not just a store of value. It is a highly cash flowing, you know, store of value. You could say it's store of value plus cash flow that's paying you, you know, a substantial dividend every year to let you accumulate another pile of money to go, you know, that you might want to store in Bitcoin and then go do something else. And so I think these are two, you know, things that work symbiotically. But
also I would say it's a way to leave a legacy. Like, you know,
absolutely.
like imagine like, you know, you're 60 years old, you're a Bitcoiner, like build a brick church for your community or something. Yeah. Like, what a legacy, you know? It's just those kind of things.
As Kelly said last night, don't let your memes be dreams.
Don't let your memes be dreams. The Citadel starts in your backyard. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty wild experiment. I do think that the monetary premium is slowly being siphoned, especially, you know, by people such as you and I or whoever that's renting and is not, you know, aping into a house on their W-2, right? So, you know, the idea is that if I'm going to store the value I've created and what I've been paid in Bitcoin, you know, versus the traditional model of, hey, I need to buy a house so that I build equity so that, you know, in 10 years or whatever, I can trade up or I can sell and go downsize, or, you know, like a lot of the boomers are trying to sell and downsize, but the problem is they have nobody to sell to. So I do think it'll get siphoned over time. And we were talking last night with a group at dinner that, you know, like what is the actual value of real estate if you had to price it today? You know, if you had to price it today on a Bitcoin standard, like what is it really? Is it the cash flowing element that it's worth? Is it the value of, you know, building a church in the neighborhood that's going to last for, you know, 500 years or whatever? How do you do that? And I think the answer is that you can't do that today the way that we have money. And that if you have a hard and sound money, then you can make those calculations because you have something that will protect, your purchasing power over a very long period of time. I think was it last night somebody was talking about when you build a cathedral, if you have money over 100 years, that if it stays, or was that at dinner? It might have been at dinner. I think it was Bitstein was talking about it, that if you wanted to build a cathedral, it would take you 100 plus years. And that if you used gold, at the time, you could afford to do that because your purchasing power was essentially protected over that period of time. But if you had to do that where inflation was 2%, you'd make it 50 years. So you couldn't even afford to build the thing. And if you apply that to how we build and plan our built environment today, it's not about even building a freeway. Yeah, I expect it's going to be there 100 years, but I don't build it so that it lasts 100 years. I don't. It's a common joke in every city you go to that the freeway is still always under construction. It's never finished. It's like, well, that's because the way that it's built, it can never be finished. It always has to be, repaired, sections replaced, expanded, the utilities under it fixed. There's all of these things that have to happen. So it's very difficult to make, the long-term calculations when, your money doesn't even last the long term.
Yeah. I think we discussed this the first time you came on the show, Kelly, but, when I was living in Chicago, that was the most annoying thing. It was spring and summer. It was impossible to drive in the city because there was so much construction because they had to redo the roads after it snowed and you salted and you plowed the roads. It would all get fucked up. And eventually it became known that it was on purpose. It was just essentially this jobs program where the city would use mid-grade gravel to repave the road every year so that it would inevitably get messed up in the winter during the snow time so that they'd have construction jobs in the spring and summer to redo it. And it's that very perverse
and
incentive.
Contributes to GDP.
Yes, exactly. And it's if you used a high grade cement or gravel to do this, you could construct it in a way. Maybe you have to repair it every 10 years, not every spring.
Yeah, I mean, the Romans figured out how to build roads. Okay, people 2,000 years ago figured out how to build roads that can last longer than what we built today. I mean, come on.
Yeah, you go to Philadelphia, look at cobble street roads that were built in the 1700s are still there. And I mean,
the Dutch still do it. I mean, I see pictures.
Yeah, I grew up on a cobblestone street, and actually the city wanted to replace the whole thing with just tarmac, and we organized a protest, and only because there was a historic building, was one commission able to kind of secure a part of the street to remain in cobblestone, that it was historically authentic looking. But yeah, it's sad, it's just assuming that there's always going to be money to maintain this new way of doing things, which is looks simpler on paper, but in the long run, the costs are far higher, and also the natural effect of cobblestones, cars do slow down when they drive on cobblestones.
Yeah.
And you brought this up last night, but this goes, again, the Fiat system is perturbed. The big meme in the world right now, whether it's related to climate or building a house, is sustainability. And they use things like LEED certifications and all this insulation stuff to be all right, if you don't hit this certification, have this insulation, you're not sustainable, which is the exact opposite, because it is not sustainable from a physical standpoint or economically over the course of 30 years. And what you're building is way more sustainable, just
objectively.
Yes, extending the time horizon of sustainability. People think, again, in quarters, years, maybe a decade.
Right.
And people
or
may
that
not know
electric
this.
cars are going to make the world sustainable. Do you have any idea how many resources an electric
cobalt.
car takes?
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's not better than combustion engine. I'm not an expert. Also, pickups that weigh twice as much as old pickups that can go 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. That sounds like a great idea, doesn't it?
No, and then sustainable, from a capital perspective, you can make it a very strong argument that the opportunity cost of time capital would increase massively under an EV fleet because of the time it takes to charge the car. It'll take you
maintainability is going to be a big issue.
Imagine the lines to charge your car when we get this out.
And the draw on the electricity grid, which we can't actually support.
Yeah.
The tire, I've learned this one, that when we talk about, air quality, and yes, it doesn't have the combustion engine and stuff like that, and those emissions, but a huge part of air quality in cities is the dust kicked up, the silica dust kicked up off highways, and then also the tire wear of all this rubber, in the air. And then there's some articles that are arguing about whether electric cars have more of that because they're heavier, and I don't really care. But just saying, like, even taking away the combustion emissions, you're still making the air really unhealthy in your cities by focusing only as cars. And, I'm not against cars at all. It's more just car light, other means of getting around where you shouldn't have to have a car to do anything, I think the Dutch model is pretty awesome, actually. I'm pretty obsessed with Dutch cities, because I think they're not like ultra dense, like even a Paris or something that's all these big apartment buildings. It's actually more row home based and a little bit less dense. I think it's like 20 units to an acre and stuff, but they've got cars, but they've got lots and lots of bike lanes, but they're protected bike lanes, and they teach kids to ride bikes when they're like 3 or 4 years old or something, which, think about the independence and the health and all those things from that.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel some compassion for like the central planners to just kind of pile them together, but because I'm just thinking about I was reading that Robert Caro book, the first part of the LBJ biography, where he talks about Lyndon Johnson growing up here in the Hill Country, like just in the 1920s, and he literally, this is 100 years ago, he went to Austin by donkey. Like, this is like, and so in 100 years, we went from that to like everything we have around here. It's just like
8
staggering the amount of change that has happened. I mean, and I think it was 150 years ago, there were only like 100,000 new immigrants living in Texas. Like, and now we're 30 million or something. But so, yeah, anyway, like I feel like just, they're very wrong and it's incredibly destructive what's happening, but kind of emotionally, it's like, I kind of get that from so much change that some people can really have a reaction of like, oh, we got to, control this somehow and let the government take care of things.
Yeah.
But they're still wrong.
Yeah, I don't have as much compassion for them as you. Kelly's got to hop on a flight. We could go on. I wish this could be a 5-hour podcast because there's so much more we could talk about. But before we wrap up, favorite city in the world?
Ooh, in the world, it had to be Edinburgh.
For living, Austin, Texas. I love this place. It's like living in a startup. And for kind of like, the conversation we're talking about, I mean, I have to say Bruges is incredible. It's incredible. Downtown Bruges, it just has everything you want, and there's beauty around every corner.
I think I'll ultimately end up liking Bruges something the best when I go, but like honestly, the
disclaimer,
city that
it's hard
enchanted
not
me
to like Bruges.
is Florence. Like it just enchants me to so many degrees. It's not just the urbanism, the vernacular, but even the Duomo and stuff, and how that got built and what it is. Of course, masonry based. So just even the dome itself. I read a whole book on it. And and the timing of it, and all the cultural things around Florence, that were happening, I just find so inspiring. And they didn't think they could do, that's what's crazy, is like, they're not any different than we are now. Like, we just automatically be like, that's impossible because of blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, that's stupid. Of course it's possible. All it takes is some people to decide it's possible. So that's what I'm gunning for.
Build.
If not you, then
There's
who?
always a way.
Yeah.
That's right.
I'm not as well traveled. Sevilla is my favorite
That's cool.
city that I've ever been to.
When I was backpacking that trip I talked about at the beginning, that kind of set me off on this journey. I spent some time there. Really, really wonderful. More of like an organic medieval city, I think. So it's got like the winding streets. It's not just all like blocks or something, like Barcelona.
Yeah, my wife and I got married over in Spain. And we started in Sevilla. We went to Ronda where we had our party. And then
I know you're talking about the bridge over the gorge.
Yeah, that's where my profile picture on Twitter is, like under that gorge. And we were supposed to go to Madrid for like a week and a half, and we wound up going for 3 days because we went back to Sevilla. We're going back to Sevilla for a week. It was so beautiful. But gentlemen, thank you for the work you're doing. It's extremely important. Again, if not you, then who? I think we can do this one block at a time.
One block at a time.
We just need. I think more people are beginning to recognize this as well, as they see it in their everyday lives. There's nothing like inflation hitting you in the face. Be like, all right, what the hell is the problem? And we need to fix the money. We need to fix our physical space. And I think seems a little dark right now, but I think we can get to a better place.
We're not
slowly
going
but
to
surely.
let this crisis go to waste.
No.
A little light and darkness goes a long ways.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, it really does. And then starts attracting the people that see it and want to value and build off of it. So that's really why I'm really hopeful.
You can't get yourself out of a situation unless you accept that you're in a situation.
Yes.
All right, one more last trope. We're going to win. Peace and love, freaks.